The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty town square as people gathered around the wooden platform that had been hastily built overnight. It was 1847, and the California gold rush had brought all kinds of people to this small frontier town. Some came looking for gold, others came looking for a fresh start, and some, like the Chinese families, came looking for any chance at survival. James Mitchell wiped the sweat from his forehead as he walked toward the crowd. At 34 years old, he had already made quite a name for himself as one of the most successful merchants in town. His general store was always busy, selling everything from mining tools to fresh bread. People respected him not just because he was good at business, but because he was fair and honest in a place where those qualities were rare. But today felt different. There was tension in the air that made his stomach turn. He had heard whispers around town about what was going to happen, but he hoped the rumors weren't true. As he got closer to the platform, his worst fears were confirmed. This wasn't going to be a regular auction selling horses or furniture. This was something much darker. The town authorities had gathered to deal with what they called the Chinese problem. Over the past few months, several Chinese families had fallen behind on their taxes, with anti-Chinese feelings running high, and new laws being passed almost daily to make their lives harder. Many of these families found themselves trapped. They couldn't pay what they owed, and they couldn't leave town without paying their debts. The solution the town council came up with was simple and cruel. They would auction off the families as indentured servants. Whoever bid the highest would own their labor until the debt was paid off. It was slavery in everything but name, and everyone knew it. But nobody wanted to speak up against it. James felt sick as he watched the first family being brought onto the platform. The father looked defeated, his shoulders slumped as he held his wife's hand. Their two young children clung to their mother's dress. Not understanding what was happening, but sensing the fear in the air, the auctioneer, a loud man with a red face who usually sold cattle, began his speech. He talked about the families as if they were objects, listing their ages and what kind of work they could do. The crowd listened with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. Some people looked genuinely interested in getting cheap labor. Others seemed as uncomfortable as James felt, but nobody moved to stop what was happening. One by one, families were sold. James watched in horror as children were separated from parents, as husbands and wives were bought by different people. The bids were surprisingly low. A whole family might go for just $20 or $30. To the buyers, it was a bargain. To the families, it was the end of their world as they knew it. Then Li Mei was brought forward, and James felt his heart break a little more. She was a small woman, probably in her late 20s, with long black hair that she kept neatly braided. But it was her eyes that caught his attention. Despite everything happening around her, there was a strength in them that refused to be broken. She held herself with dignity even as the auctioneer began describing her like she was livestock. Behind her came her 7 children, and James had to grip the fence post to steady himself. The youngest couldn't have been more than 3 years old, a little girl who kept reaching up for her mother. The oldest was probably 14, a boy who was trying his best to look brave for his younger siblings. They were all clean and well-dressed despite their circumstances, which told James that Li Mei had been a good mother who took care of her family even when times were hard. The auctioneer explained that Li Mei's husband had died in a mining accident 6 months earlier. She had been trying to support her children by taking in washing and doing odd jobs around town, but it wasn't enough to pay the mounting taxes and fees that seemed to appear every week. Now she owed $7 in back taxes, and since she couldn't pay, she and her children were being sold as a group. $7. James spent more than that on his lunch most days. This woman's entire life, her children's futures, everything they had ever known was being destroyed over $7. The bidding started slowly. A few men in the crowd called out low numbers, treating it like a game. James could see the fear growing in Li Mei's eyes as she realized what was happening. She pulled her youngest daughter closer and whispered something in Chinese to her older children. Even without understanding the language, James could tell she was telling them to stay close and be brave. As the bidding continued, James learned more about the family situation. Li Mei had been married to a man named Chun Wei, who had come to California with dreams of striking it rich in the gold fields. Instead, he had found backbreaking work in dangerous conditions for very little pay. When a mine shaft collapsed and killed him along with several other Chinese workers, Li Mei was left alone with 7 children and no way to support them. She had tried everything. She took in laundry, cleaned houses, and even tried to sell handmade crafts in the market. But the town's growing hatred of Chinese immigrants made it harder and harder for her to find work. New laws were passed almost weekly, making it illegal for Chinese people to own certain types of businesses or work in certain jobs. The taxes kept going up, and the deadlines for payment kept getting shorter. The bidding was now up to $5. And James could see that Li Mei was trying not to cry. Her 14-year-old son stepped forward slightly, as if he wanted to protect his mother, but she gently pulled him back. She knew that any sign of resistance would only make things worse. For all of them, James looked around at the crowd and felt ashamed of his community. These were people he did business with every day, people he considered neighbors and friends. Yet here they were, watching a mother and her children being sold like animals, and most of them seemed perfectly fine with it. Some were even enjoying. The show. The bid reached $6, and the auctioneer was getting ready to close the sale. The highest bidder was a man James recognized as Ben Crawford, a local rancher who was known for being harsh with his workers. James had heard stories about how Crawford treated the Mexican laborers on his ranch, and the thought of Li Mei and her children ending up there made his blood run cold. In that moment, something changed inside James. Maybe it was the way Li Mei stood so straight and proud despite everything happening to her. Maybe it was the way her children trusted her completely, even in this terrible situation. Or maybe it was just that he couldn't stand to watch this injustice happen without doing something about it, without really thinking about what he was doing. James raised his hand and called out, $7? The crowd went quiet. Everyone turned to look at him, including Li Mei. For a moment that seemed to last forever, nobody moved or spoke. Then the auctioneer, seeming confused by the sudden silence, called out, $7? Do I hear 8? Ben Crawford looked angry that someone had outbid him, but he didn't raise his hand again. $7 was already more than he wanted to pay for what he saw as just another batch of workers. Other potential bidders seemed surprised that the well-respected merchant James Mitchell had entered the bidding at all. $7 going once, the auctioneer called. Going twice. He paused, looking around the crowd one more time. Sold. To Mr. Mitchell for $7. And just like that, James found himself the owner of 8 human beings. As the reality of what he had just done sank in, he felt his hands shaking. He had acted on impulse, driven by compassion and anger, but he had no idea what he was going to do next. The walk from the town square to James's house felt like the longest walk of his life. Behind him, Li Mei and her 7 children followed quietly, their footsteps echoing on the dusty street. James could feel the eyes of the townspeople watching them from windows and doorways. Some looked curious, others looked disapproving, and a few looked downright angry that he had interfered with what they saw as natural order. James's mind was racing. What had he gotten himself into? He lived alone in a modest 2-bedroom house behind his store. It was comfortable for one person, but how was he supposed to house 8 more people? And what was he supposed to do with them once he got them there? The legal papers in his pocket said he owned their labor until the debt was paid, but the very idea made him feel sick. As they reached his front door, James turned around to face his new responsibility. Li Mei stood perfectly straight, her hands resting on the shoulders of her youngest children. Her face showed no emotion, but James could see the fear in her eyes. She was probably wondering what kind of man had bought her family, what he would expect from them, and whether her children would be safe. The language barrier hit James immediately. He tried to explain that he wanted to help them, that he wasn't going to treat them badly, but Li Mei only understood a few words of English. She nodded politely at everything he said, but he could tell she didn't really understand what he was trying to communicate. Her 14-year-old son, who seemed to understand a bit more English, translated quietly for his mother in rapid Chinese. James opened his door and gestured for them to come inside. The family hesitated for a moment, then Li Mei gave a small nod to her children and they all filed into the house. James watched as they took in their surroundings with wide eyes. His house, which had always seemed perfectly adequate to him, suddenly felt both too small and too luxurious at the same time. The children stayed close to their mother, the younger ones clinging to her dress. The oldest boy kept looking around as if he was trying to figure out if there were any escape routes. The youngest, a little girl who couldn't have been more than 3, started crying softly. Li Mei picked her up and whispered something soothing in Chinese, but James could see the exhaustion in her face. That first night was chaos. James had no idea where everyone was going to sleep. He gave Li Mei and the 3 youngest children his bedroom, while he tried to make sleeping arrangements in the living room for the older children. It was cramped and uncomfortable, and James spent most of the night lying awake on his kitchen floor, wondering what he was going to do. The next morning brought new challenges. James had always eaten simple meals, bread, coffee, maybe some eggs if he was feeling fancy. But now he had 8 additional mouths to feed, including small children who were probably used to completely different foods. When he offered them bread and coffee for breakfast, the children looked uncertain, but Li Mei accepted gracefully and made sure her children ate what they were given. James noticed that Li Mei ate very little herself, probably to make sure there was enough for her children. This broke his heart, and he made a mental note to buy more food when he went to the market later that day. But first, he had to figure out the more immediate problem of what everyone was going to do all day. His first instinct was to tell Li Mei that she and the children were free to do whatever they wanted, that they were guests rather than servants. But when he tried to communicate this through gestures and the few Chinese words her son had taught him, Li Mei looked confused and almost worried. Through her son's translation, James learned that she was afraid he would be angry if she didn't work. In her experience, people who paid money for you expected you to earn that money back through labor. So James found himself in the strange position of trying to convince someone that he didn't want them to work for him, while she was insisting that she needed to work to justify her family's place in his home. Finally, they reached a compromise. Li Mei would help with cooking and keeping house, but only because she wanted to contribute, not because James was forcing her to. The first few days were filled with small discoveries and adjustments. James learned that Li Mei was an incredible cook. Even with his limited ingredients, she managed to create meals that were more delicious than anything he had ever tasted. She had a way of combining simple ingredients that made them taste completely different. The children, who had been quiet and fearful at first, began to relax a little as they realized that James wasn't going to hurt them, but the outside world was less welcoming. When James went to his store the next day, several of his regular customers made pointed comments about his new pets and asked when he was going to put them to work in the store. A few customers even suggested that he was being too soft with them, that Chinese people were naturally lazy and would take advantage of his kindness if he let them. James found these comments infuriating, especially since he could see how hard Li Mei was working to take care of her family and contribute to his household. She was up before dawn every morning, preparing breakfast and organizing the children. She had somehow managed to make his small house feel more organized and comfortable than it had ever been. The children, too, were helpful and polite, despite being in a strange place with people they didn't know. The language barrier remained a constant challenge, but James was surprised by how much they could communicate without words. Li Mei had a way of expressing herself through gestures and expressions that was often clearer than speech. When she smiled, which happened more frequently as the days passed, her whole face lit up. When she was worried about something, James could see it in the way she held her shoulders. Her children were equally expressive. The youngest girl, who had been so frightened that first day, began to warm up to James. She would peek at him from behind her mother's skirt and giggle when he made funny faces at her. The older children remained more cautious, but James could see them starting to relax as they realized that their new situation, while strange, wasn't dangerous. The biggest surprise came when James realized how much Li Mei understood about running a household efficiently. She had a talent for organization that amazed him. Within a week, his house was cleaner and more organized than it had ever been. She had somehow managed to create sleeping arrangements that gave everyone enough space and privacy. She had figured out how to make his small kitchen work for a family of 9 people, but it was more than just practical skills. Li Mei had a calm, steady presence that made everyone around her feel more peaceful. Even James found himself looking forward to coming home each evening, something he had never really experienced before. For the first time in his adult life, his house felt like a home rather than just a place where he slept. The children, too, were remarkable. Despite everything they had been through, they were well-behaved and helpful. The older ones looked after the younger ones with a maturity that broke James's heart. They had clearly learned to take care of each other during the difficult months. After their father's death. As the first week turned into the second, James began to realize that his impulsive decision at the auction had changed his life in ways he never could have imagined. What had started as an act of compassion was becoming something much more complicated and meaningful. These people weren't just guests in his house anymore. They were becoming part of his daily life, part of his routine, part of his world, and, despite all the challenges and uncertainties, James was beginning to think that maybe, just maybe, this unexpected arrangement might work out better than anyone could have predicted. 3 weeks had passed since the auction, and James's life had settled into a rhythm he never could have imagined. Every morning, he woke up to the sound of Li Mei quietly preparing breakfast in the kitchen. The smell of her cooking had become one of his favorite parts of the day. She had somehow learned to make his simple ingredients taste like something from a fancy restaurant in San Francisco. The children had started to come out of their shells too. The youngest girl, who had cried so much that first day, now ran to James when he came home from work. She would grab his hand and chatter at him in Chinese. And even though he couldn't understand a word, her excitement made him smile. The older children were helping around the house and even in his store, proving to be quick learners and hard workers, but it was Li Mei herself who surprised James the most. As her English improved day by day, he began to see just how intelligent and capable she was. She had opinions about everything from how to organize the store inventory to which customers seemed trustworthy. More than once, her suggestions had helped him avoid problems or make better business decisions. One afternoon, Li Mei approached James with a concerned expression. She had been watching the store's daily operations and noticed something that James had missed. Through her broken English and hand gestures, she explained that one of his suppliers had been shortchanging him on deliveries. She had been keeping track of what came in versus what was paid for, and the numbers didn't match. James was amazed. He had been so busy with the day-to-day running of the store that he hadn't noticed the discrepancy. When he confronted the supplier, the man admitted to the dishonesty and promised to make it right. From that day forward, James began asking Li Mei for her opinion on business matters, and her insights proved invaluable. Their language barrier was becoming less of a problem, too. James had started learning basic Chinese words while Li Mei's English was improving rapidly. Their conversations were still a mixture of English, Chinese, and lots of hand gestures. But somehow they understood each other better than James had understood many people who spoke perfect English. Li Mei told him stories about her life in China, about the village where she grew up, and about the dreams she and her husband had shared when they decided to come to America. James shared stories about his own journey from Ireland, about the family he had left behind, and about the loneliness he had felt building his business in this frontier town. But their peaceful routine was constantly threatened by the growing tension in the town. The California legislature had passed new laws making life even harder for Chinese immigrants. There were talks of special taxes, restrictions on where they could live, and even discussions about forcing all Chinese people to leave the state entirely. James began to notice the looks he got when he walked through town with Li Mei and her children. Some people whispered behind his back, calling him foolish for treating Chinese people so well. Others were more direct in their disapproval. Old Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house, stopped him on the street one day to tell him that he was setting a bad example for the community. The situation got worse when a group of local men started making trouble. They would hang around outside James's store, making loud comments about Chinese people and how they were taking jobs away from real Americans. They never did anything that James could complain to the sheriff about, but their presence made Li Mei and her children nervous about leaving the house one evening. As James was closing up the store, he found threatening messages that had been slipped under his door. The notes warned him to get rid of his Chinese family or face the consequences. James felt a chill run down his spine as he read the crude handwriting. These weren't just idle threats from drunk men in the saloon. Someone was seriously angry about his arrangement with Li Mei's family. That night, James made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of being scared away by the threats, he felt more protective of Li Mei and her children than ever. When he told Li Mei about the threatening notes, she offered to take her family and leave town to avoid causing him trouble. But James refused to even consider it. He realized that somewhere along the way, these 8 people had become more than just house guests or employees. They had become his family. The thought of anything happening to them made him angrier than he had ever been in his life. The next day, James did something that shocked the entire town. He walked into the sheriff's office with the threatening notes and demanded protection for his family. When the sheriff asked what he meant by calling them his family, James looked him straight in the eye and said they were under his protection and he would hold the town responsible if anything happened to them. Word of James's visit to the sheriff spread quickly through the small town. Some people thought he had lost his mind. Others began to whisper that maybe there was more to his relationship with the Chinese woman than just charity. A few people, particularly some of the women in town, quietly admired his courage, though they would never say so publicly. The tension came to a head one afternoon when James returned from a business trip to find Li Mei crying in the kitchen. Through her tears and broken English, she told him what had happened. A group of men had come to the house while he was away, demanding to know where the Chinese family was hiding. When Li Mei's oldest son tried to protect his mother, one of the men had pushed him down. James felt a rage unlike anything he had ever experienced. The thought of these cowards threatening a woman and children while he wasn't there to protect them made his blood boil. But Li Mei grabbed his arm before he could storm out to confront the men. Through her tears, she made him understand that violence would only make things worse for everyone. Instead, James came up with a different plan. He started carrying a gun, something he had never done before. He also hired 2 men to watch the house and store when he wasn't around. Most importantly, he made it clear to everyone in town that Li Mei and her children were under his personal protection, but the most significant change was in how James and Li Mei looked at each other. The shared danger had brought them closer, together in a way that surprised both of them. James found himself paying attention to little things about Li Mei that he had never noticed before. The way she hummed quietly while she cooked, the gentle way she spoke to her children, the strength she showed in the face of all the hatred directed at her family. Li Mei, too, began to see James differently. She had always been grateful for his kindness, but now she saw the courage it took for him to stand up to an entire town to protect her family. She saw how hard he worked to make them feel safe and welcome. She saw the loneliness in his eyes that matched her own. Their conversations became longer and more personal. Li Mei would stay up after the children went to bed, and she and James would sit by the fire talking about their hopes and fears. James learned about the pain Li Mei still felt over losing her husband, and Li Mei learned about the dreams James had given up when he decided to focus only on building his business. One evening, as they sat talking by the fireplace, Li Mei reached over and touched James's hand. It was a simple gesture, but it sent a shock through both of them. They looked at each other for a long moment, both realizing that something had changed between them. What had started as compassion and gratitude was becoming something much deeper and more complicated. Neither of them spoke about it that night, but both knew that their relationship had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The question now was what they were going to do about it. The morning after Li Mei had touched his hand, James woke up with a strange feeling in his chest. He had barely slept, his mind replaying that simple moment over and over again. For the first time in months, he felt nervous about going downstairs to face her. What if he had imagined the connection between them? What if she regretted that gentle touch? But when he entered the kitchen, Li Mei looked up from preparing breakfast and smiled at him in a way that made his heart skip. There was something different. In her eyes, a warmth that hadn't been there before. She handed him his coffee, and when their fingers brushed, neither of them pulled away immediately. James realized he was falling in love with Li Mei, and the thought terrified him. Not because of who she was, but because of what it would mean for both of them. A white man marrying a Chinese woman in 1847 California wasn't just unusual, it was practically unheard of. It would mean facing even more hatred and violence than they were already dealing with. But love, James was learning, doesn't care about social rules or practical concerns. Over the following weeks, he found himself looking forward to their evening conversations more than anything else in his day. Li Mei had a way of listening that made him feel understood in a way he had never experienced before. She asked thoughtful questions about his business, his dreams, and his past that showed she genuinely cared about him as a person. Li Mei was struggling with her own feelings. She had loved her husband deeply, and part of her felt guilty for having romantic feelings for another man. But she also couldn't deny the connection she felt with James. He had shown her and her children more kindness than she had ever expected to receive in America. More than that, he treated her as an equal, asking for her opinions and valuing her thoughts in a way that made her feel respected and appreciated. The children began to notice the change in their mother and James. The youngest one started calling James Uncle James without being prompted, and they would run to him for comfort when they were hurt or scared. The older children were more cautious, but even they began to warm up to the idea that James might become a permanent part of their family. Li Mei's 14-year-old son was the most protective of his mother. One evening, he approached James and, in his careful English, asked what James's intentions were toward his mother. James was touched by the boy's maturity and courage. He explained honestly that he cared deeply for Li Mei and wanted to protect and provide for their family, but that any decisions about the future would be up to his mother. The conversation James had been avoiding finally happened on a quiet Sunday evening. The children were all asleep, and James and Li Mei were sitting by the fireplace as they had done so many times before. But tonight felt different. There was an electricity in the air that neither of them could ignore. James struggled to find the right words. His heart was pounding as he tried to explain his feelings in a way that Li Mei would understand. He mixed English with the Chinese words he had learned, stumbling over his pronunciation but speaking from his heart. He told her that she had brought light into his life, that her children had become like his own children, and that he couldn't imagine his future without them. Li Mei listened with tears in her eyes. When James finished speaking, she was quiet for a long moment. Then, in English that was much better than it had been 2 months ago, she told him that she had feelings for him too. She explained that she had never expected to love again after losing her husband, but that James had shown her that her heart was still capable of love. But Li Mei also voiced the fears that had been keeping her awake at night. She was afraid of what marriage to her would cost James. She had seen how people in town already treated him differently because of his kindness to her family. Marriage would make the situation much worse. She was also worried about her children, and whether they would be accepted in a mixed family. James took her hands in his and looked directly into her eyes. He told her that he had thought about all of those things, and yes, it would be difficult. But he had also realized that a life without her would be far worse than any challenges they might face together. He promised her that he would protect her and her children, no matter what anyone else thought or said. The proposal itself was awkward and sweet at the same time. James had been planning to make a formal speech, but when the moment came, all his carefully planned words disappeared. Instead, he simply asked Li Mei if she would marry him, mixing English and Chinese in a way that made her laugh despite her tears. Li Mei's answer was yes, but she asked for time to prepare her children for the news. She also wanted to make sure James truly understood what he was asking for. Marriage to her wouldn't just mean taking on a wife, but taking on 7 children, who would always be seen as different in their community. James's response was to gather all the children together the next evening and formally ask their permission to marry their mother. The youngest ones were excited and immediately started planning the wedding. The older children were more serious, asking James important questions about how their lives would change and whether he would still love them if he and their mother had children of their own. James answered every question honestly and patiently. He promised them that they would always be his children, that he would work to give them the best life possible, and that he would never let anyone hurt them because of their background. By the end of the conversation, even Li Mei's protective oldest son was smiling and calling James father. But the happiness in James's house was overshadowed by the storm brewing in the rest of the town. Word of the upcoming marriage had somehow leaked out, and the reaction was swift and brutal. James's business partners sent him letters saying they would end their relationships with him if he went through with the marriage. Several of his biggest customers announced they would take their business elsewhere. Even worse, James's own family, back in Ireland, sent him a letter expressing their shock and disappointment. His brother wrote that marrying a Chinese woman would bring shame on the family name and that James should reconsider before it was too late. The letter hurt James deeply because he had always been close to his family, but it didn't change his mind about Li Mei. The most painful reaction came from people James had considered friends. Men he had known for years crossed the street to avoid talking to him. Women who had been friendly when they came into his store now acted cold and distant. The isolation was harder than James had expected, but every time he looked at Li Mei and her children, he knew he was making the right choice. Li Mei felt the weight of the disapproval too. She offered several times to release James from his proposal, telling him that she couldn't bear to be the reason he lost his business and his standing in the community. But James refused to even consider backing down. He told her that a business built on hatred and prejudice wasn't worth keeping, and that friends who would abandon him for loving someone weren't really friends at all. The final test came when the local minister refused to perform the ceremony. He told James that he couldn't in good conscience marry a Christian man to a heathen woman, and that such a union would be an abomination in the eyes of God. James was furious, but Li Mei surprised him by taking the rejection calmly. She told James that if their love was real, they didn't need anyone else's approval, not even from the church. As they planned their wedding despite all the opposition, James and Li Mei grew even closer. They were united not just by love, but by their shared determination to build a life together despite the odds against them. They had each other, they had the children, and they had their faith that love could overcome hatred. The question now was whether the rest of the world would give them a chance to prove it. The wedding took place on a crisp autumn morning in James's backyard, with only a handful of witnesses brave enough to attend. Since the local minister had refused to perform the ceremony, James had to travel 3 towns over to find a preacher willing to marry them. The man was older and had seen enough of life to believe that love was more important than social conventions. Li Mei wore a simple white dress that she had sewn herself, combining American wedding traditions with subtle Chinese details that honored her heritage. James had never seen her look more beautiful. Her oldest son walked her down the makeshift aisle between 2 rows of chairs, his chest puffed out with pride at the important role he was playing. The few guests who attended were an interesting mix. There was Dr. Williams, the town's physician, who had quietly supported James throughout the controversy. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly widow who ran the town's small library, sat in the front row with tears in her eyes. A couple of James's employees from the store had come, along with 2 Chinese families who had traveled from Sacramento to witness this historic moment. But the most important guests were Li Mei's 7 children, ranging from the 3-year-old girl who kept giggling during the serious parts to the 14-year-old boy who was trying not to cry with happiness. They had all played a part in planning the wedding, from picking flowers to helping their mother with her dress. As James and Li Mei exchanged vows, they spoke not just to each other, but to the children who were becoming their shared family. James promised not only to love and protect Li Mei, but to be a father to her children and to give them the opportunities they deserved. Li Mei promised to stand by James no matter what challenges they would face, and to help him build a home filled with love and understanding. The ceremony was simple but deeply moving. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the small crowd erupted in applause and cheers. Li Mei's children rushed forward to hug their new father, and for a moment, all the hatred and prejudice in the world seemed very far away. But the real test came the following Sunday, when James decided it was time to introduce his wife to his extended family. His cousin Robert lived just outside of town with his wife and 3 children, and James had always been close to them. He had written to Robert about his marriage, but had received no reply. Now it was time for a face-to-face meeting. James arrived at Robert's house with Li Mei and all 7 children in tow. The look on Robert's face when he opened the door was one of pure shock. He had read James's letter about marrying a Chinese woman, but seeing it in person was entirely different. For a moment, nobody spoke, and James wondered if he had made a terrible mistake by coming, but then Robert's wife appeared behind him, took one look at the situation, and invited everyone inside for dinner. She later told James that she had been curious about Li Mei ever since receiving his letter, and that seeing the love between James and his new family had convinced her that they had made the right choice. The dinner was awkward at first, with lots of polite conversation and careful questions, but Li Mei's natural warmth and the children's good behavior gradually won over Robert's family. By the end of the evening, Robert's own children were playing games with Li Mei's children, and Robert himself was asking James about his business plans for the future. However, not all family meetings went so smoothly. When James took Li Mei to meet his elderly aunt, the woman took one look at them and slammed the door in their faces. She later sent a letter disowning James and saying that he had brought shame on the family name. James was hurt by the rejection, but Li Mei comforted him by pointing out that they were building their own family now, one based on love rather than obligation. The reaction from the broader community was mixed and often surprising. Some people, who James had expected to be supportive, turned their backs on him completely. But others, particularly some of the women in town, began to quietly show their approval. They would smile at Li Mei when they passed her on the street, or make kind comments about how well behaved her children were. The real surprise came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Henderson, the boarding house owner who had criticized James months earlier, approached Li Mei at the market one day. She apologized for her previous harsh words and admitted that watching James's devotion to Li Mei and her children had changed her mind about mixed marriages. She even offered to help Li Mei if she ever needed a friend in town, but the biggest change came in James's business. While he did lose some customers who couldn't accept his marriage, he gained others who admired his courage. Word of his story spread to other towns, and people began traveling specifically to do business with the man who had married for love despite social pressure. Li Mei proved to be an invaluable business partner. Her organizational skills and natural understanding of people made the store more efficient and profitable than it had ever been. She also brought connections to the Chinese community that opened up new opportunities for trade and commerce. The children thrived in their new environment. James enrolled them in the local school, despite some protests from other parents. The teacher, Miss Rodriguez, was a young woman who believed that all children deserved an education. Under her guidance, Li Mei's children excelled in their studies, with several of them showing particular talent in mathematics and reading. Li Mei's oldest son became James's right-hand man in the store, showing a natural aptitude for business that impressed everyone who met him. The younger children helped with simpler tasks and charmed customers with their politeness and eagerness to help. Even the youngest girl, who had been so frightened on that first day, now greeted customers with a bright smile and a cheerful good morning. As the months passed, James and Li Mei's marriage became a symbol of hope for other mixed couples in the area. They received letters from people across California asking for advice on how to handle similar situations. James and Li Mei always responded with encouragement, telling people that love was worth fighting for, but that it required courage and commitment from both partners. Their home became a gathering place for others who felt like outcasts in their communities. They hosted dinners for Chinese families who were struggling with discrimination, and they provided support for other mixed couples who were facing opposition. Li Mei's cooking became legendary, and their Sunday dinners often included a dozen or more guests. The ultimate vindication came 3 years after their marriage, when Li Mei gave birth to their first child together, a healthy baby boy who had his father's eyes and his mother's smile. The town that had once rejected their union now celebrated the arrival of the newest member of their community. Even some of James's harshest critics had to admit that the baby was beautiful and that James and Li Mei were wonderful parents. By this time, all 7 of Li Mei's children had found their own paths to success. The oldest son had become a partner in James's expanding business. 2 of the daughters had married and started their own families. The youngest children were excelling in school and talking about their dreams for the future. James often thought back to that day at the auction when he had impulsively bid $7 for a family in distress. He had thought he was saving them, but in reality, they had saved him. Li Mei had brought love, purpose, and joy into his life in ways he never could have imagined. Her children had given him the family he had always wanted but never thought he would have. Their story became the stuff of local legend, told and retold as an example of how love could triumph over hatred and prejudice. Years later, when their grandchildren asked them to tell the story of how they met, James and Li Mei would smile at each other and begin with the words, "It all started with $7 and a choice to do what was right instead of what was easy." Their love story proved that sometimes the most unexpected beginnings can lead to the most beautiful endings.